Well, happy Thursday. We're excited to dive in. Today, just to kind of cut right to the chase, we want to talk about how to make your business work for you in a way that produces smoothness, a way that produces a flowing private practice. I think when you first launch a business, it's really bumpy, right, Attilio?
Yeah, I think too when you first start, you're thinking like, what strategies, what things can I do? What do I need to happen? Maybe you don't know a lot of things, and so
Yeah.
very bumpy process.
It was bumpy for me at least. I
Yeah.
do know some people that it felt like it was less bumpy. It got bumpy later on or whatever it is, but I think the outcome is to have your practice feel like you're on the highway, a constructed road. You're driving, you're going down, require some time, attention, whatever, but like you're not on the back country road just trying to get through the woods, right? And that's kind of how it is when it first starts out. There's a lot of different facets that I think both produce a smooth experience in your business, but also create the bumps along the way if done incorrectly. And there's tons of different ways that we have approached this problem in our own business and in the businesses that the private practices that we work with. But we want to really highlight one key solution that's sort of at the root of consistently making your business flow better, consistently making your business be smooth. And this doesn't go away. When you first launch your business and it's just you, right? This is super important. And as you grow and add your first team member and your 10th team member and your 50th team member, right? This becomes more and more important actually as you go up. And it's this topic or this idea of ownership inside your business and ownership inside of the different components of your business.
Yeah, really when you kind of boil it down, there's only really like five or six elements to run like a smooth flowing private practice. And a lot of these elements are actually centered, especially if you're in a group. A lot of these elements are centered around like the marketing and sales sides of things. There's really only two or three elements on like the fulfillment and doing a good job with the team, and what does retention look like for clients? What does it not look like? Are we getting our clients results? What does the pro? So like, there's only a couple elements in there for those sides of things, but there's really like four or five core elements for the marketing and sales process. And I think a lot. We've seen it this week a lot, and that's why we really spurred up this conversation today. But there's so many private practices, whether you're solo or group, that don't have explicit ownership over segments of their marketing and sales process. So who's responsible for developing or improving your marketing channels? Who's responsible for connecting and qualifying those individuals who are opting in? Who's responsible for the sales conversations? Who's responsible for the onboarding? And so I think like a lot of private practice owners take a naive approach where it's like one of us will do it if you're in a small group, one of us will do it, or we'll share it, we'll split the responsibility.
Yeah.
um, or you'll be like, that's my, and you just throw it into the admin bucket.
Yeah.
That's my admin who does that. And it's just like this miscellaneous stack of like everything that the admin does. And I think that's where you really lose a lot of potency when it comes to improving and running. I love the analogy, the highway analogy. Running on this highway here for your private practice.
Yeah, to take that analogy a step further, and even the lack of sometimes responsibility in a private practice, when you are a solo practice, essentially, right? You're in the car driving by yourself, and if we bring it to just what needs to happen in the car, right? Well, driving at minimum, seeing the clients, turning the steering wheel, like that is a singular process. But if you want music, if you want the windshield wipers on, if you want to eat a snack, if you want to do anything in the car other than the gas pedal and the steering wheel, that's also on you. And you're stuck with that, right? When you are a solo private practice, you're wearing all the business owner hats. And what's interesting here is a lot of solo private practice owners forget that maybe that there are other things that need their time, attention, or ownership, because you've never owned it before. No one told you that it was your responsibility. Switch notes for a second, right? You move into your own house post college. Let's say you were on a meal plan, and you just showed up to the dining hall. You didn't have to grocery shop. You didn't have to cook. You didn't have to clean. If you lived in a communal dorm room, if you lived in a condo association, like, right, someone else participated in some degree of ownership for all these accoutrements. But you get your own house. You are in charge of your own food. You do whatever in life, right? Suddenly you have 100% ownership. And so sometimes a ton of things fall through the cracks, because you're used to only owning a couple small parts of the whole business, like seeing clients. And then what happens is your experience of seeing clients, right? That was 100% of your time, 100% of your responsibility before you launch this business. And now that actually needs to become 20% of your ownership and responsibility in terms of prioritization to make the rest of the business grow. But to go back to the car analogy, as you grow, you get that co-passenger, you get that first admin. Just because that other person is in the car next to you doesn't mean that they've been delivered or they've taken on any ownership yet. And we can almost assume, unless we explicitly spell it out and we tell them what they need to do, how we want them to help, and what is their new role, right? Hey, your job is the music. Choose the music, play the music, skip the music. I don't want to touch it, right? Like, it's your job to make sure we have a good time and we're bopping along the road. Um, Without that explicit level of direct communication, the rest of those activities are still on you. And so what happens a lot is, just as Attilio said, is you get that admin, you're like, oh, that's just in my admin bucket. And then you get mad when the admin doesn't do their thing, or the clinician doesn't do their thing, or your marketing team or vendor or whatever doesn't do their thing, because you had a mountain of expectations on how many problems that thing was going to solve. Mountain of problems your software you thought was going to solve, or your admin you thought was going to solve. And they could possibly solve that problem, but you actually haven't delivered them the ownership needed to take it and to solve the problem for you, or to own the activity that needs to happen in that bucket consistently. Because a Google ad vendor doing Google ads alone doesn't solve or fix all of your marketing problems or deliver full ownership of the marketing bucket of things. That may be a small portion of it, but that's where we see a lot of failure, a lot of big bumps in the road that could be avoided.
Yeah, I wanted to just dig in on one thing you kind of glanced on here, and it's like this element of, hey, the admin, they own the music in the car. But I think oftentimes, especially when we're smaller, we try to package up elements, and I think the angle that I wanted to just dig in on further here was that packaging can sometimes be really unhealthy. And so what we look at is we're saying, hey, you're admin, you're responsible for the environment in the car. And so they choose the environment. To them is like the air conditioner and the music, right? And so that'd be like the equivalent of saying, hey, admin, you're responsible for uh you're responsible for, if someone reaches out to us, you get them started, right? You give them
Yeah.
that type of information. And then when certain elements aren't hit, we're getting maybe angry, expectations aren't met, we fire them, we hire someone else, we try to do something else, but we're not clear on exactly what needs to happen and the exact strategy that needs to essentially be delivered. And
Yeah.
so I think when it comes down to some of this like extreme ownership, I think it's so important, no matter how scary it is, no matter how inexperienced we are, no matter how little we like to do it or want to do it. I think we need to take some time to be in the trenches. We need to take some time to understand what it takes to be successful in this component of the practice, so that we can effectively say what kinds of things need to happen. And so,
Yeah.
looking at our car analogy, hey, in order for this car to run, we need to have rock and roll music, and we need to have it at a cool 69 degrees, and we need to have lights on the bottom part of the car lit like this color, and that's how the team's going to perform best, that's how I'm going to perform best, that's how we make the most profits, that's how everything happens without getting any balls dropped.
Yeah.
And so Don't be afraid to be in the trenches. Don't be afraid to take ownership, even if it's for just a little bit. The worst part is, I think oftentimes a solo practice or even a group is the first business that you're running. And so a lot of things are scary, and we're rushing to maybe delegate, or we're rushing to maybe put things on other people's shoulders, but we
Right.
have no idea how the core of the practice runs or what core elements are required to find success. And
Yeah.
so don't rush, take ownership, and get extreme clarity on the minimum viable system, the single system, to find that really, really smooth path so that you guys can bop down the highway.
Yeah. And to describe that a little bit, and we go in depth with this, and we'll probably do a more clear training on this in the future. But essentially, you have how do we generate someone being interested in our business? How do we get that person in a sales context, book a call with us, to visit our website, to take the next step? How do we convert them and onboard them into being a consistent paying client for our service? And then how do we deliver that service, right? And if you're a solo practice, you need to do that whole cycle, you know, successfully 20 times, right? Till you have a full caseload. And then as many times after that, depending on how fast client drops, right? And then essentially if you have 10 practices, great. You need to do that 200 times and then keep that full if you have 10 clinicians on your team, to keep a full caseload full and keep that consistent. And it's just upping the volume and the consistency and the smoothness of how many times people flow through that cycle. And we can get really bogged down at the different processes and the different checkpoints essentially to go through this entire business journey. And we just encourage you to like slow down, figure out how do I do each step successfully one time, right? And then how do I, great, that worked for me one time, but I'm probably not going to be able to do it in this way if I do that 20 times a week or 100 times a week, right? And that's where like scale, systems, operations, team members come in. Well, I definitely can't deliver my service in this way, 100 times in a week, right? There's only one of me, okay? That's where you're hiring clinicians. That's where you're scaling up. But to boil this all down, your ability to be smooth about this is your ability to run the business in the way that you want. And I think, you talked about it at Attilio, but sometimes what happens is you expect especially the team member to have the same level of ownership that you have, especially if they're like an 18 to even like $35 an hour employee or less, depending on your area, depending on what you're paying. I just want to set the expectation that they are probably not a super strong thinking brain in your business, meaning they aren't just naturally going to take ownership and say, yes, let me own this, figure this out, improve this process. And that's the biggest thing. What this means to say, hey, can you market for me? Or hey, can you do this thing for me? They will do it in whatever state, if not worse, than the way you showed them or asked them to do it. And there probably won't be incremental improvements unless you invest in the ownership of the incremental improvements in that intake process, in that marketing process, in that web process, in that sales process, whatever it is. So, in this level of ownership, business goes a lot better if you assume that you have to have really concrete clarity on the improvement and the task delegation for your team members so that way they are clear on what does it actually look like to do this role well, what's actually on my plate. Because when that's really undefined, and a lot of times when you have a really big role, right, because it's your first admin hire, it's your third or fourth admin hire, right, a lot of stuff can get lost in the weeds on what actually are the performance things that they need to own and stay on top of, and that requires you to know them first.
Yeah. My last point is, if you're working in a practice where there's a lot of assumed roles, just give someone the role, whether it's you or the other person. And I'm talking specifically to the business partner duos out there that are trying to share jobs or trying
Yeah.
to both work on one thing or both trying to work on one thing or try to overlap. Just stop, just split the role. One of you is responsible for it and the other one can be responsible for something else, because if you don't know who owns it, you don't know who's accountable for those items. If you don't know who's accountable for those items, you don't know how to fix the problems.
Yeah. And I go back to, if you haven't assigned, whether it's business partners or team members or whatever, if you haven't explicitly assigned ownership with clarity, even for yourself, right? And we see that sometimes, like, you need to own the marketing process, you need to own the quality of the onboarding, you need to own the close ratio on your sales calls, right? Someone needs to own it. Sometimes that's you, sometimes that's a team member, but we have to be explicit about who owns it. And when we do that, we have the ability to really smooth out the experience in all parts of our business.